Have you got questions about sourdough? It seems to be this kind of scary thing that people want to embark on but don't feel like they can, or they just have a lot of questions and things don't really make sense. I was totally in your position and I determined to get to the bottom of it because there are just so many benefits of having real sourdough bread. It's so good for your body. You can actually enjoy bread as God intended if you know how to work with this sourdough process. And I don't think He meant for it to be all this difficult or confusing, but there is a little bit to understand. And so I hope to make a really quick, easy video just explaining to you how I feed my sourdough, how I keep it active and dormant when I don't want to use it, and how I make bread really simply every week. All that matters is that you have a starter from someone or your own that has some activity, and what that means is it smells sour and usually you can see some bubbles. Now I'm going to speak in metaphors here to help illustrate how this all works. I'm going to refer to my starter as a little animal, and I'm going to refer to the flour I feed it as food. And hopefully that'll make sense of what's going on here. So it's a pretty big animal. And in order to feed this animal, I need to give it a lot of food because it's quite big. Now, in order not to waste my flour, I'm going to get rid of a large part of this animal to make it smaller because I want to feed it a minimal amount of food. So to do that, I usually have a discard tub in my fridge, and I just pour almost all of it out. For the amount of sourdough that you need to bake a bread, you don't actually need very much. And so I'm going to take this animal and make it smaller. And what I mean by that is I'm only gonna keep about 50 grams, so a little less than a quarter cup of an animal, and I'm going to feed it 1 cup of flour and a little less than 1 cup of water. You can mix both white flour and whole wheat flour, or whatever kind of flour. Just keep in mind that if you are using more whole wheat, it will take a little bit more water. That's great. And then I'm going to use my hand to mix it, which seems a little bit gross, but there's actually a lot of bacteria, there's yeast and things in the air, especially on your hands, and so it's good for your starter to mix it with your hand. If you don't want to do that, you can just use a fork or a spoon, whichever. And I'm going to let this sit on my counter until tomorrow, when I will repeat this process in the morning. Hello, this is day 2. I'm going to do pretty much exactly the same thing I did yesterday because I'm just trying to revamp this sourdough starter. But before I do that, let me just show you what it looks like. Pretty much risen exactly to where it was the first time I showed it to you, which means that that little bit that was left over, fed with some flour and water, has now again made this animal this big. And so to do the same thing, I'm going to get rid of pretty much all of it in my discard bowl, which today is just a green waste container that I'm about to run outside to the green waste. But that looks about good. Again, you want just roughly 50 grams, very little, that's just the base of my container, or about a quarter cup, just less if you want to measure and be specific. So I'm going to feed it about 1 cup of flour, and a little less than 1 cup of water. Now my water is about 95, maybe 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, a little bit warmer than lukewarm. And again, I'm using my hands to stir this all in here. And again, I'm going to let this sit on my counter for today, and tomorrow we start getting into the good stuff. This is day 3, and today I'm going to mix my bread. And so I'm going to start by feeding again my sourdough this morning. I have already discarded pretty well all of it into this discard bin container. But today I'm leaving 100 grams instead of the 50 grams I did the day before. So that's about a half a cup, maybe a little less. I'm trying to leave that much in here because I actually want to have a little bit of a larger starter by the time I get to mixing my bread tonight. That's because I'm going to use some of it for the actual bread mix, and I want enough to bake 2 breads, and I also want some left over for my starter to live on. So I'm gonna leave a little bit more today, which means I need to feed more. So for the past 2 days, we have fed 1 cup. Today I'm going to feed 2 cups, about 2 cups. And I'm actually going to do a little bit of white flour and a little bit of whole wheat. So I have done about 1.5 cups of white flour and 1/2 cup of whole wheat. Double what I did yesterday. We've been mixing it with 3/4 cups of water, and today I'm going to do 1.5 cups. Again, the water is warmer than you think, a little warmer than lukewarm. Nice and kind of a thick battery consistency, as you can see in there. I'm going to leave this on my counter for the day. It is about 8 hours since we fed our starter this morning. As you can see, it has risen a bunch. We fed it more, and so it is a bigger starter at this point. So I'm gonna mix my dough now. I'm using a volume scale to get the measurements. Just find it easier that way. And I will leave the recipe down in the description box below. So I'm just going to burst out rough measurements here as I go. So I'm mixing about 800 grams of white flour and about 90 grams of whole wheat. And then I'm gonna add in about 684 milliliters or grams of water. Now my water is about 90 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit again. That's warmer than you would think. So it is worthwhile grabbing a thermometer and actually checking the temperature of your water. Knowing and keeping notes, the end temperature of your dough and keeping notes of that stuff really helps in sourdough to sort of figure out how you can manipulate certain aspects of your mixing to affect your rise. And so keep notes. I would say keep notes, take measurements. It's definitely worthwhile. I'm going to mix this with my hand, and then I'm going to let it sit here for about 20 to 30 minutes to autolyse. This process is important. I'm not all that knowledgeable about it, but there's something about the flour and the water sitting on its own for a little while. The process is called autolyse. You can Google it and learn more about it. Now before we lose too much daylight, I just want to show you how much this starter has risen and looks active and bubbly. It even smells a little bit sour. That's what you're going for. And it is ready to be mixed into this dough and used to do its little eating job. I'm doing about 22 grams of salt, and then I wet my hand and scoop out 216, or you can pour. And then I'm going to use my hand to mix it all in together. Kind of wet it again. How I'm doing that is I'm just taking my hand underneath and kind of flipping the dough over top of each other. Over and over. I'm gonna mix for about 5 minutes. I'm also using my pinchers now and then to pinch the dough kind of into these sections, and then flipping some more just to get everything really well mixed. I'm going to leave this dough here for about 12 to 15 hours. In the first 2 hours before I go to bed tonight, I'm going to be applying 3 to 4 folds. And what that is I'm just taking the edge of the dough and I'm stretching it as high as I possibly can without tearing it very carefully, and folding it over top of the dough. And I'm doing that sort of in a circle all the way around. So for me, usually that's about 4 flaps to fold in until I've made it all the way around. And this is going to start build that structure of the bread, kind of what helps with the rise. So take care with these folds, they matter, and it usually is easiest to do it in the first couple of hours. So from now until I go to sleep tonight, I'm going to be doing my 4 folds with about a half an hour between each. It doesn't really matter. Just watch until the dough has kind of settled again, and then come back and keep doing your folds until you've done about 4 of them. And then tomorrow we are going to divide, shape our loaves, and bake them. All right, today is the big day. We are baking. My dough rose a lot overnight. I am making double batch, so that is why it seems like so much. But my dough was about at the 5 liter mark when I mixed it yesterday, and it has, maybe even below, and it has doubled and tripled. So this is the time to now do it. We're about 14 hours later. I'm going to turn out this dough onto the counter, split the dough with this handy tool into 4 sections. fold over the dough and make a little round ball. While I am making these folds, I'm taking really good care not to be too rough with the dough because a lot of the structures have built overnight and are in there, and so I don't want to be rough with the dough and wreck the buildup of these structures. Taking care to be very, very gentle and hold the dough shape. And then kind of tighten it as I go. This process is called divide. For proofing baskets, I actually don't have those little fancy baskets. I just have bowls, and I put in a little dish towel, and then I very generously flour, letting the dough proof before you bake it. That can range anywhere from 30 minutes to 4 hours, and the way that I know the bread is ready to bake is by doing a finger dent method test. And so all that is taking your finger and poking the dough, and if it jumps back at you, it's not ready for baking. If it does not jump back at you, but holds its shape, then you know you are ready to bake. And by that point, you want your oven preheated to 475 degrees Fahrenheit, and your Dutch oven heating up with your oven. I just did a finger dent test after shaping my loaves, and they're giving me signs that they're pretty well ready to bake. Now I'm doing 4 loaves, and if I had 4 Dutch ovens, I could do them all at once if they would fit into my oven. I only have 2 Dutch ovens, so I could bake 2 and put the other 2 in the fridge at this point. Or what I like to do recently is just to have 2 of these bread loaf pans and pop my sourdough right into here. I know they're shaping as circles right now, and is that weird to put them into this shape kind of pan? No, it's not. And actually I have found that if you're having trouble with rise and not really getting a bread that seems to have the volume you want it to, this is actually a really nice cheater method because it sort of squishes this dough into this shape and makes a beautiful sandwich loaf. So if you're expecting it not to do the rise like you had hoped because some of your timing or temperature was off, pop them right into these. It still bakes wonderfully. I have some questions prepared here that I think are most frequently asked, and I'm gonna run through them really quickly and give you some of my answers. So what flour should you use? It's good to use a flour that is really high in protein, and you can usually check that on the back of the flour packet, check out the label, and it'll tell you the protein content of the flour. A good range to have is between 10 and 12, and just makes the best bread and sourdough bread. What is hydration? So the hydration that you frequently hear spoken about in sourdough bread is the ratio between water and flour, which will affect how sticky or tight or liquidy your starter ends up being. So if I'm feeding my sourdough starter, let's say half and half, 50% flour and 50% water, that's going to be a pretty runny starter to add to any kind of bread or baked goods. Most frequently, I think it's recommended to bake your bread with 70% hydration. So when I'm feeding my sourdough starter, I'm feeding it 1 cup of flour and 3/4 cup of water, which gives you a consistency that is closest to the actual bread dough when you are mixing it. Can you feed more or less ratios when you're feeding your sourdough starter? Absolutely. If you are just going to be feeding it for the sake of getting it active, you can feed very, very little ratios like we talked about. I just kept about 50 grams of starter and then fed it about 1 cup of flour and 1/3 of a cup of water. Not very much. And you can even half that, keep 25 grams of your starter and feed half of those portions. The smaller your starter, the less you feed it. The larger you want it, the more you have to feed it. And some people need to keep a much larger starter because they are doing a lot more baking in a day and they will need a lot more. So let's say they're baking bread and they're baking sourdough biscuits and cookies. Then you want to feed your sourdough starter a lot because you want a bigger animal to use for various things. There can be very little waste, or there can be a lot of waste if you are feeding it too much by keeping too much. And this is where people run into trouble, where they feel bad about throwing out a lot of their starter or discarding it for something else. They feel bad about doing that, and so they keep a larger animal than they should, and they don't actually feed it enough flour, and then it all goes sour from there. So if you want to feed less flour and water, keep a smaller starter to get it active, and then you can always feed a lot the day that you need to do the actual baking. Now, how do you get a good rise? This is a good question because there are a lot of factors at play here, because there's a relationship between the temperature of your water, the temperature of your house, the temperature of your flour, the final temperature when you've mixed the dough, and how that temperature changes as the dough is fermenting. So lots of things at play here. Oh, and also your autolyse period, where you're actually leaving the dough, the water, and the flour to sit first before adding the rest of the ingredients. So many things coming together, and that is why it is totally worthwhile for you to be keeping notes. Now, I learned mostly from this book called Flour, Water, Salt, Yeast, I think that's the order, about this baker in Oregon. And he would say that a good starting point is to try to get your final dough mixture. So this is after you've added the flour, the water, the salt, and the yeast. When you've done all of that, you want your dough average temperature to be around 77 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit. I think that's 26 Celsius. Yes, 26 Celsius. He says that that is the best range for your dough to develop the best gas, and he recommends that you use water that's about 95 degrees Fahrenheit, so 35 degrees Celsius, when you are mixing your dough, to sit the autolyse period for 20 to 30 minutes, and then keep records from there. When you started mixing, when you finished, and how long it took for the fermentation to when you're actually baking. If you keep notes of all of these things, you will start to see where you can manipulate things to change. So for example, you may use 95 degrees Fahrenheit in the summertime because our houses are usually cooler if we're using air conditioning. But you may choose to use a less warm water in the winter because our houses are usually warmer, and so you actually want your temperature of your dough to be a little bit less warm because the ambient temperature is warmer. Do you see how these things start coming into play? So keep notes, keep records. At room temperature, your final dough mix should come to be around 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and so shoot for that. And if you don't get exactly that, make some adjustments next time and see how that impacts the turnout of your bread. Now, why is sourdough actually healthier for you? I made a whole video about this. It's actually very interesting. I'm not super knowledgeable about it, but from my understanding, this little yeast animal is feeding on the grains in the flour and actually fermenting it to a point where it is more readily acceptable for your body to process it and receive it. I also recommend watching a documentary on Netflix. I think it's called Cooked Baked. Let me see, what's it called? It's called Cooked, yeah. That was very helpful in understanding why sourdough is better, this ancient process that I think God designed so perfectly for us to have this nutritious and very filling meal. Totally worth it. Get baking sourdough bread. If you have any other questions, would you leave them down below in the comment section? Well, thank you so much for joining me. I hope that this has been very helpful to you. And if you like content like this, would you consider subscribing, sticking around, and catching some of our upcoming content? All right, see you, bye.